Thank you, Joe. Appreciate it. I think you're in for a real treat tonight with Alicia and Steve, who are incredible experts in their fields. And we wouldn't have considered moving further forward, in my opinion, without these two professionals who have a great deal of background and experience. And I was surprised to find out about Alicia. I knew Steve fairly well, but Alicia worked for, as Joe told us, for Frank Welsh, who I worked for on the Grand Central Terminal many years ago. So we had that in common, so that was kind of fun to learn. So I'm here to talk to you just a couple minutes about the Historic Structure Report, also called an HSR. And this HSR is really important to historic sites. I have here the first third of the HSR. I brought it so you understand how voluminous it is. This was all its history, and I'm going to tell you a little more about that. But then we also had treatment and recommendations, a record of treatment, and we also did the HSR for the study. So we did both of these things all in one fell swoop. It took a little while. I think I spent 2.5 years researching it before I put pen to paper. And I like to say that I took Mark Twain on vacation with me every time I went on vacation, because I was reading his book about Elmira and some other resources. And it was a lot of fun. So what is an HSR? Historic Structure Report has really 3 components. And so we did the 3 components for Quarry Farm, for the house, specifically for the house. And then the second part of this report was for the study. So what does an HSR do? First of all, it talks about its developmental history of who was there, when they were there, what they did. And this was a lot of fun to learn about Mark Twain and his family that for 20 years summered here and wrote his most prominent books, in my opinion, and I'm sure the opinion of many others, some of which he wrote in the house until Susan Crane, his sister-in-law, had the study built, which is just to that side. That's the east side of Quarry Farm, which at that point had an amazing view down over the valley, as does the front porch of Quarry Farm, the house, today. But you could even see much more then, because there weren't the trees that we have today that obscure the view. So learning about its history, writing about its history. Then we talk about the physical description. From an architectural perspective, we talk about every space. We talk about all the finishes, where there were wood floors, what was on the encrusta on the walls in many cases, and details and details and details. Then we do we talk about the character-defining features, which of course, one of which is the parlor, but also the individual architectural features. And then we do a condition assessment on every single space. So we talk about how the conditions of what's existing, are there roof leaks, are there, what the issues are, the fact that there was no fire suppression system, which was a very big deal, as you might guess, because if Quarry Farm, despite the fact that Steve is living right behind the building or connected to the building, we wouldn't know if there was a fire festering someplace before it really got going. So the fire suppression system was something that was missing. And then after going through all of these issues of the assessment, we came up with the treatment and work recommendations for the building. So number 1, as you heard, was what we installed was a misting system that is now up and running, thanks to the commissioning that was done, finished only weeks ago, and a generator, which we're still waiting for the transfer switch to arrive from Cummins engine. And supposedly it's being shipped tomorrow. That's what I hear. And another one of the issues that we discovered was that the drainage system on this building was really lacking. So we came up with a plan for how to remedy that. So there was a whole list of things that we came up with that we prioritized. We worked very closely with Joe and his team. And then as far as the study goes, it was really the same drill. We learned about its history, the fact, of course, that it was right next door to Quarry Farm, or on Quarry Farm, named because there was a quarry here. And then moved in 1952 to the Elmira College campus. And its story, how Mark Twain used the study to write his books beginning in 1874, and what books he wrote, and the cats that he used to love to see there, and all the other outbuildings that were right next to the study, where his children played and adults would gather under a tent. There were all these really magnificent old structures that no longer exist. We have some evidence of a little bit of it, but not a lot. But then we go through the same thing. Its condition, the study's condition, and what we recommend, and prioritize those. And of course, one of the two most important issues that we came up with were the windows, which weren't functioning, and the exterior and interior finishes. And those are the two items that you're going to hear about tonight. And they're going to tell you all about that and what they did. And I am so pleased that we were able to, or I should say Quarry Farm was able to bring on board these two incredible professionals who really did an amazing job at their work. So I will hand you back over to Joe, or Steve, are you coming right up? Steve's coming up. Okay.
Well, I want to thank Joe for asking me to be here tonight, and thank you all for coming out on a cool, rainy night. I prepared this for a different venue, so I'm going to skip over some of the front material to what's relevant for tonight, if it's okay with you all. I was asked to work on the windows at the study. I guess Joe called me, or maybe Alicia, I don't know. No offense, we have an older crowd here. I'm 72, and I had just had back surgery. And so I really wasn't up to it. And so, of course, I said, yes, I'll do it. Okay? Because I couldn't turn it down. And so I called my former apprentice, Daisy Goldstein, which is her name up here, who was working over in Hudson, New York. And she joined me both to take the windows out and to put the windows back in again. And then she worked for me to restore them. So I want to give Daisy credit because she was a big part of this. We'll skip all of this initial stuff. I will say that prior to doing the study, I worked on the windows over in the parlor. That was pretty interesting because that bay, as all bays on all these old houses do, the bay had deflected, and it had deflected a lot. Okay, and so I'm trying to think, well, they don't want to, how am I going to do this? They don't want to spend a lot of money. And I did it, and Alphonse Pieper down at Historic Ithaca helped me do it. If you don't know windows, it looks great. It's kind of wonky. And then a year later, Joe sent me a lot of pictures of the house. Well, I thought I was dealing with a stucco house that was all masonry. And I thought, well, we're never going to fix this. We can't fix this deflection. It would be horrendously expensive. I didn't realize that it's just a frame house that was originally clapboards, okay? I might have insisted that we jack it up if I had known that. I never have told you that, okay? But there we go, all right? Here we go. this is meant for a much longer presentation, so I'll try to do this as quickly as I can. I've been restoring windows for, I don't know, 20, 22, maybe 25 years. I've worked in the trade since I was a boy. And when I arrived to look at these, the first thing that I thought about or I noticed was, yes, they need work. The maintenance has been poor, but they're really not in terrible shape. And the reason for that is the little study has a wonderful overhang. And as you all probably know, an overhang protects the house. It's one of the most important features on an old house. The windows mostly were stuck, and there were a few, or the sashes, and there were a couple that's still open. Well, let me go back here. The first thing I had to do is unstick the sashes, which is pretty easy. If you got, especially when you stand on the ground and access them from the outside. Interestingly, we'll get into this, there was a, whoops, wrong hand. There was a stop block under every upper sash. Holding that upper sash in that position, I didn't really think about why that was there. We'll get to it. The first thing we did, first day, is that Daisy labeled, from the inside looking out, we identified every piece of old glass that may have been original, okay? And so we labeled each piece of glass to go back in that position, all right? Now, a lot of it wasn't original. Some of it was even plexiglass, but we just wanted to you know, it's a great property. That needed to be done. Then we secured the openings, okay? And this is an expensive way to secure an opening. Sometimes it's called the HUD method, other housing and urban development HUD, or do no harm method. And we put a piece of plywood in the blind stop rebate. You put a board on the inside, and then you have carriage bolts that go all the way through. There's no way to grab that bolt. And so I'm not putting a screw or a nail or anything, not any damaging fastener into the property. Okay. I used to have, and don't anymore, but Jim Turner in Honeyway Falls has a window steambox. That's a steambox. It's made especially for taking the putty out of windows and removing the top layers of paint, not all the paint, top layers of paint. That's a very expensive, you know, $8,000 tool. So we put these windows in a steam box, or sashes, that's a sash, for 45 minutes at 200 degrees, okay? And you can see what it looks like right out. And this is the first thing we noticed. A lot of the glass wasn't glass. It was plexiglass, okay? There were 4 or 5, maybe 6 pieces of that in there. On the glass that was there, we cleaned up all the old paint and putty. We submerged them in water with a little detergent and left them for a week or two, and so that glass cleaned up nicely. I will say, if you leave any of that on there, even if it's 100 years old, it will look like your mess when you've redone them. So you want to be careful to clean them up well, okay? After they went through the steam box, we cleaned these up with heat guns or infrared tools, but we cleaned them up with heat. And here we're stripping the paint residue off with a heat gun. Daisy's been working on these. If she didn't have that respirator on, I wouldn't have used a picture. Normally someone will say something derogatory if you do. You're going to die of lead poisoning or something. We had to scrape the profiles, and when you scrape the profiles, that part of the muntin, you know, the little pieces in between that hold the panes, you want to make sure you don't gouge them out. So we have drawers full of tools to fit every profile so that you can do it neatly. Here we are using the different profile scrapers on the muntins and on the stiles and rails, okay? There were a lot of repairs. When you make a wooden repair on a window like this, it's called a Dutchman repair. I'm not a carpenter, but after 20 years I do a fair job. So here, here you can see part of the putty bar was missing, and then down below you can see the whole muntin was broken off. So I replaced it, and I tried to do the same joinery. It's mortise and tenon with a wedge between it to hold it in tightly. A lot of repairs like that, okay, and then where there's gaps, we'd fill that in with epoxy. More Dutchman repairs. And then here Daisy is sanding the flat parts with a sander connected to a vacuum cleaner, Festool vacuum cleaner. But the profiles we sand by hand, so you can't see it, but the sandpaper, I have a putty knife in that sandpaper to hold it rigid and keep from tearing my fingers up. I have to do that on every one of them until it's perfectly smooth and bare. And the wood was not rotten, mostly. There might have been a few places. The wood wasn't rotten, but it's what we refer to as punky. It was a little soft. Over the years, there might have been a few times when it was bare. And so we consolidated it with 50% boil linseed oil and 50% turpentine. That's a really old-fashioned thing to do. Most people that restore windows now will just put oil primer on there, okay? We found a little bit of graffiti on one. We were excited about that, okay? All right. After the linseed oil and turpentine dried 2 or 3 days, prime them in oil primer. I want you to understand that that's the oil primer that was available before New York State took the good oil primer away from us. And those of us who care, those of us who in the window business who care, we now bring in contraband oil primer from Ohio and Pennsylvania. And I go south every year and I bring the whole back of my car full of primer for my friends that want it. The new primers that are available here are not very good products, okay? It's illegal to sell those primers here. It is not illegal to use them. Be careful about that, okay? Yeah. And there's nothing a painter used to like more than priming with a good China bristle brush, and that's what I'm doing here, okay? Like I said, some of the glass was original and a lot of it was gone. But in this picture, you can see the wavy glass, how beautiful it is. And I didn't replace every piece. That piece does not look old, or maybe as old as the rest of it. But I did, to the degree that I had glass, salvage glass. That's an 1850, 1860 window sash. We recycle salvage glass for that purpose. I pick it up off the curb usually. Sometimes I buy it, but not very often. All right. When we glaze the windows, we've primed the rebate, where the glass goes, where the putty goes. We primed it. Then if you take that sash to the hardware store, they just drop the glass in it and glaze it. Wrong. Okay. What you're supposed to do is put a bed of putty in that rebate, or rabbit. Rebate's English, rabbit is American. We're supposed to put a bed of putty in there. So that's what she's doing. She's back bedding the rebate here. And then we drop the glass down into that, smush it in, and then we put in our glazing points. Okay. Some of the glass was pretty fragile, so this gun shoots them hard, so I've got a little barrier underneath it so I didn't break the glass. This putty is called Sarco, and it's a linseed oil based putty, and most window restorers use it because it's made to dry enough in a week to paint, and DAP won't dry all summer, okay? So this putty cost us a whole lot of money to have shipped and brought in, but it's a specialty product that we all use. Here we're putting the points to hold the glass, and the muntins were really fragile, okay? So she's holding a block of wood behind it because that gun shoots it so hard, the point so hard, to keep it from deflecting. And now she's glazing, okay? And I know that's her because she has these little hands and those gloves don't fit, and you can't buy them in a small. And so whenever I go to the hospital which I go several times a year for a visit, I'm sorry to tell you all, if you're in a medical business, I steal enough smalls when they leave me in that room alone. I will steal them for Daisy to use, okay? You can't buy the smalls. All right, here we're glazing. The important thing about the glazing is that it not show from the inside. So from looking out, we're right here, for example, there's a sight line, okay? And that's where the glass meets the sash frame. We don't want to see any paint or putty in the sash line, so we'll be pretty careful about that. And then we brought them back to the site, okay? Painted, ready to go. Talk about the paint a little bit. Now, Alicia's going to talk more about this, and you should pay more attention to what she says and what I say. But this is the interior during the stripping process, okay? And this is what we saw. This caramel brown, kind of lighter brown, was the newest paint, and I think 1952 probably, or about then. That's the paint you see now when you go in it. It's a thin layer of oil-based enamel. Then under that was a brown, that color, and under that was white, which is a primer. I was particularly interested in the primer, because in the 19th century, they didn't often use white primer. Okay, you could make it, and you could buy it, but more often than not, what they would do is just thin the finish coat extra thin with linseed oil. Okay, that would be the primer. Still, the books talked about using primer, and you could get it. So I was a little surprised to see this is the outside, and there's that white primer, same primer we saw here. You can see it where it was failing, and that's in his later years. I don't know if these windows were ever stripped or what. So here's what I found with the paint, okay? That's the paint layer over the white that I saw. Just chocolate brown, okay? And on the side of that, now that's just paint. If we painted your windows today, there's not a lot of difference, okay? That's just paint, all right? That is the paint that was in the jams, okay? Now, Alicia's going to talk about this. I'm only going to mention it. It was common in the 19th century to sand paint buildings. And what they would do is put a coat of oil-based paint on either on the whole building or on details, and then they would blow sand onto that wet oil paint to look like stone. And it really looked like stone, okay? Well, they had done that. They did that on this building. And so in the jams on the outside, I had that sanded paint. And so you can see here, this is why I chose that color. It just seemed good enough. Good enough for Joe, as they say. All right. About sanded paint, that's from an 1866 How to Do Everything book, Dr. Chase's Recipes. That was a method to blow it on. Here it is at Mount Vernon. They just did the front of the building, and they just took buckets and threw it on, okay, on the wet paint. Then they would catch it in sheets below and then reuse it, okay. That's pretty darn convincing, all right. Now here's the interesting thing about the whole project, all right. I don't know if you see anything weird here, but this is a slip head window. I took the job and the windows were stuck. I didn't pay any attention. I go, oh, they're just double hung windows, you know, just like every other job. No. The sashes are slip head. They go up into the wall, both of them, okay? Both disappear, all right? So we realized that. Then this was the condition that one of the pulleys, that's the pulley for the upper sash, and every one of the pulleys for the lower, these had been prepared for a pulley, but all of those pulleys were gone, okay? But they had put those pulleys in because there was a screw hole and the holes were boogered up. So I know the pulleys went in, but they didn't work, okay? I'm going to go back to that. Slip head window. This is a double hung window, and this is how a double hung works. You bring the lower sash down, up, and the upper sash down, and theoretically you get convection ventilation. That worked really well on a house with floor-to-ceiling windows. Didn't work so well in little windows after the 20th century. Okay, but ours didn't work that way. The windows went up into the wall. And so where were those other pulleys? Well, the other pulleys were way up in that wall, okay? And my arms weren't tall enough to reach up there, okay? And there's one of them, all right? You can see how bad they were. It's called a screw pulley. And we couldn't reach them to get them off. There you go. This is from a 1940 catalog. Those are screw pulleys, so it really wasn't rare. Although you can't buy them now. And if I ever see any of those in an antique store, I'll buy them and give them to you for the future, okay? So we invented a tool here to stick up in there. And down below we had a cross piece to turn it, you know, like you would a wrench. And we got most of them out, but some of them just broke off because the rusting was so bad. And you can see the rusting, and I don't know if any of you have ever used Evapor-Rust, but it's a pretty great product for cleaning up rust. All right, I'll show you. That's after soaking in that for 2 or 3 days. Okay, it worked pretty well. It wasn't perfect, but it worked, and every pulley worked after we took it out. Cast iron pulleys, by the way. So for the screw pulleys that broke, this was my solution, and it worked. It worked fine. Just a small pulley hung on a screw hook. Okay. Some of the original cord was there, and it's twisted hemp. Twisted cord preceded braided cord, which is what we use now. Braided cord is a better cord. On the other hand, the hemp cord is really strong and lasted a long time. So I showed that to Joe, and he said, well, can we still get it? And I go, I don't know, we'll try, okay? And there's a business in California that specializes in all things hemp. Hemp clothing, hemp rope, hemp everything, okay? And so I was able to buy 100 feet of hemp, okay? And 1/8 inch, which is what we would call number 8 sash cord. You'll see that we had squirrels or critters in the walls and some of the pockets. And how did we install the sash cord? Well, there's 2 ways to do sash cord. If the cord's gone, missing, it's not hanging over the pulley anymore, we use what's called a mouse. And so we tie this mason's line on here, then that's just a piece of sash chain. We throw it over the pulley, catch it, tie the cord, pull the cord over the pulley tight to the weight. Okay, you can see I'm doing that here. All right. The other way, if there's any of the cord showing, is to take a piece of tape and tape your new cord to your old cord and then pull it over and retie the weight. That's a little quicker and always easier if you can do it. Here we are tied in, okay? When it came time to rehang the sashes, I was wearing out. And I had said to Daisy that morning, it's 10 o'clock, I'm already tired, my back hurt. And I said, I want you to watch me closely. You didn't know this. I said, if I seem to be failing, stop me, because I'm going to take a double dose of OxyContin. And I did. You know, I don't take drugs. But I didn't know how I was going to do this, and that's how I got through that day, okay? Once we started installing them, we realized why the other pulleys wouldn't work. They were just at a position where the window would not go all the way up into the wall. So they had to stop, reconnoiter, and think, well, how can we do this? And that's why they put those other pulleys way high up like they did. Usually, a sash cord goes about right here. We had to attach them way down here. That's a little unusual. Okay. The hardware, it's amazing. The hardware is original and it was all there. It was not in good shape, but it was all there. Okay. This is East Lake style cast iron. It had a patent date on it. 1870s or something, I don't know. If you can, this is hard to see, but here's two of them together, okay? You'll notice two tension springs. That's what makes that lock work. And they were broken on every one of them except maybe that one, okay? And see, there's no tension springs in there. That means that the little arm just goes around and around and around. This is above and beyond the Call of Duty, I think. But anyway, and here's a picture of the original lock. There's a picture of the original lock. You can tell it was exactly what it was. So I went down to Historic House Parts, and they keep that spring steel, okay? And I used their shop, and I was able to put new spring steel tension springs in those. I don't know how long that'll last. I hope they worked when I did it, okay? But that's pretty fragile, all right? These locks were painted, and so I soaked them in vinegar and salt to get them into that condition, all right? If they have paint on them, we'll cook them in a crock pot with a little clothing detergent, but we may have done that first, I really don't remember, but the tarnish wouldn't come off at all. And so the vinegar and salt cleaned the tarnish off. I don't know why. They had locks, but they also have spring pins, okay? Is it because the locks didn't work? Is it because the locks broke? This is redundant, double locks, okay? Spring pin not only can hold the window up, but it's also a lock to keep anybody from coming in. And then, you know, to confuse me more, it had slide bolts, okay? So now we have three redundancies. The slide bolts were painted. I cleaned them up and I put them back on again. They don't work very well. They were missing pieces. I couldn't fix those. But I put them back on too. The slide bolts were not over paint. They were over the white primer only, okay? So. And it's the last day, and there's Daisy, job well done. She got in her car and drove back to Hudson, where she works at a restaurant making $500 a night in tips. I mean, only in Hudson, huh? Did you go to Hudson 50 years ago? You're scared for your life. It's not that way anymore, okay? Most of this work was done in Jim Turner's shop in Honeyway Falls Millwork, under the guidance of Mabel and Odin, every day underfoot. And that was the last day. And I was shot. And I kissed Daisy goodbye, and I got halfway home and pulled over at the rest stop and slept in my van for an hour and a half before I could get home. And I did it, and it just nearly killed me. Thank you all. That's what I got. You know, I could drag that out for a full hour and a half if I needed to. So I kind of sped through it.
All right. Well, first of all, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to have worked on this building with Steve and Alicia and her team, Joe. It's been an exciting opportunity, and also thanks to Joe, Alicia, and Steve for getting in touch with me about doing paint analysis on this important building here in Elmira. Thanks to everyone for coming out tonight to hear our presentations, and a special thanks for my family for driving all the way up from Binghamton to join us as well. So my work involved looking at the original interior and exterior finishes on the study when it was built in 1874. My project had two objectives. The first one being determine the original finishes on the interior and exterior, but then also in conjunction with the Elmira faculty and some students, determine the characteristics of the sand that was used on the paint when it was sanded at that time. Both of these things are very important when it comes to the restoration and determining color and texture to simulate that stone-like finish that Steve mentioned earlier. So I started this project in 2023. Started with the outside and then moved to the inside. I think the first impression I had is, wow, that's a lot of detail on that building to do paint analysis. When I looked at all the gingerbread, soffits, eaves, frieze boards, it ended up taking about 95 samples from both the interior and exterior of the building, and there were a total of 59 different pieces that I ended up sampling. And I have to thank my husband as well, Todd, for helping me do some of that sampling. There were high places. It's hard to get at some of the old wood to extract the wood from the piece on the building. To do this sampling, I have some show and tell for the project, but it's really simply using an X-Acto knife. It's digging into a piece of wood gently, not to mar it too much. But each sample had the wood and then later layers so that I could see the full history of the paint on the building. And the reason I took so many samples is it's very important to compare and contrast the different samples to see if they shared the same history. Perhaps they used a different color on one piece versus another. So in some cases too, I took two samples from one piece just to make sure they matched. And when I examined them, there was no confusion in what I was seeing. As part of this, a lot of organization was involved. I took each sample and I used envelopes like these, just small, to keep each sample. Had them labeled, laid out, and it really helped me stay organized as I looked at all of the detail on the exterior and then all of the detail through the interior. All these panels, baseboard, there was a lot, but it was important and necessary in the end. Another point about sampling is I focused on the areas that had the best evidence. I wanted to pick areas that haven't been touched a lot by hands, that weren't damaged by a lot of use. So I wanted samples that had as much original evidence as possible. From there, I examined each sample under a microscope. So what this allowed me to do is see what the layering looked like in a very close-up view, and I'll share what that looks like in just a second. And then from there, when I found out what the original finish, or where it was in my sample, I visually matched that layer with a representative color swatch. So I used various decks to help align original colors with something that exists today in the paint world. And then for the interior, I found out early on that the earliest layer was made of shellac, and denatured alcohol helped me determine that, because shellac dissolves when you apply denatured alcohol to it. So I was pretty confident that shellac was the first finish on the interior. So here are my findings on the exterior. As Steve mentioned earlier, the building was a sanded finish, and what helped me discover that was really this picture that I'm going to describe in more detail. But what sanded is wet paint is applied to a building, and then sand is either thrown or blown on top of it to give it a stone-like finish. And the base paint color that I uncovered was kind of a medium to darker gray, kind of brownish undertones. I think that's closely representative of what it looks like. But this next picture is a photomicrograph. And this is a cross-section of a paint sample that was taken off the building, magnified probably 35x 40 times with the microscope. What you see here is the bottom of a sample. The wood is missing. It fell off, unfortunately, during the process of me embedding this in epoxy and creating this cross-section. But this is the bottom of the sample. This is the topmost layer of the sample. What I first saw when looking at this sample close up, here and then in other examples, is that all of the exterior that had original evidence had a white primer. It's very faint, but you could see it here on the bottom. The arrow points to it. From there, the first finish is this very thick gray paint with these kind of globs stuck in there. Those are the sand grains. And this was a clear indication that we were looking at a sanded finish on the Mark Twain Study exterior. What I also saw was many of the sand grains also existed on the surface. So that told me the sand was not mixed in and applied, but blown or thrown on afterwards. From there, what I saw under the microscope, and hopefully you can see that too, and I think I have a pointer.
Top button.
Top button, thanks, Joe. There we go. This is better. There's lots of these brown stripes. These are later layers of brown paint that was applied to the building, probably after the sanded finish wore thin, but they used brown paint to coat the building. And this will give you an idea of how thick a sanded finish is in comparison to these later oil and then eventually latex finishes on the building. This orangey brown layer here, this linked closely to the 1952 era when they moved the building from Quarry Farm to the Elmira campus. So, making these involves taking a small sample, embedding them the samples in an epoxy resin and then sanding them very fine to get the perfect layering to view it clearly. All right, so that's the exterior. Interior, quite different than the exterior. Here, the insides were finished with amber shellac over wood. So almost like how you'd see a piece of furniture. So the base color was orangey, probably a semi-gloss, maybe a little more glossier because shellac has a very high gloss finish. What helped me determine that was, like in the photomicrograph, taking a cross section, seeing the shellac soak into the wood here. These are later layers of paint that were applied, and the inside is now painted. This would have to be removed to get to the original shellac finish. Looking at a sample or segment that was taken from the building from the top, you can see the amber shellac here. And then here it's a little darker. This is just age, dried out finish. That's turned color over time. I imagine inside the building there is a fireplace, candles, so any soot or dirt is going to build up on that shellac, and it was evident in the samples that I looked at. So the next stage, once we determined that we had a sanded finish, is to figure out, well, what kind of sand is it, and where did it come from? So for this part of the project, I relied on Elmira College faculty and the students to help figure that out. They had the skills and the knowledge and the equipment to do that. So I want to give a big thank you to the Elmira faculty and students that were involved. Dr. Trevor Browning, he's the assistant professor of environmental science. Professor Chris Longwell, associate professor of art. Dr. Veronica Moorman, associate professor of biochemistry, and Abigail Belcher and Nathan Romano. All of them were involved in doing chemical analysis, burning of the sand, which I'll explain, or of the samples, which I'll explain in a little bit, and then also characterizing the grains of sand and associating them with locations in the Elmira area. All right, so to analyze sand, there were 3 basic steps. So the first thing that we had to do was actually get samples off the building that had enough sand that would allow us to do this exploration. So Joe one morning came out and helped me take about 4 decent-sized samples from various parts of the building that had good evidence that remained. We gave those samples to Professor Longwell and Veronica Moorman to do 2 different methods on the sand. The first was chemical. So we tried to dissolve, with their help, dissolve the samples in sodium hydroxide. The purpose of this was to dissolve the paint and then just leave the sand grains behind. What we discovered, though, is that the latex paint on the building that was used later did not dissolve very well. So it was leaving a lot of residue behind and making the sand particles very hard to see. So we resorted to burning. Professor Longwell ended up taking the samples and heating them to 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. For the most part, that high temperature dissolved or disintegrated the paint and left the granules behind. The granules were clean and allowed Professor Browning to examine them closely to see where they what they were and where they came from. He did use a microscope, and he took 2 field trips, excuse me, one to the Chemung River to look at the sand there, and also Quarry Farm, where there is sand as well. So based on Professor Browning's analysis, he found that the sand particles were dominantly composed of quartz, and there's also mica and feldspar thrown in there. To give you an idea of size, the quartz grains are 1 millimeter in diameter, roughly. On average, though, the grains were 1/4 to 1/2 millimeter in diameter. So it is a pretty fine, consistent surface of sand applied to that paint. So we feel in the restoration, looking at the sand from either Quarry Farm or Chemung River is going to give us a good representation of what was originally on the building. We do believe that the sand had to be cleaned, so removing any debris, particles that shouldn't belong on the building, and also filtered to get this consistent size on the surface. Below is a microscopic view. It's about 20x magnification. That gives you an idea of what Professor Browning saw to do his evaluation. So these little angular pieces that are dark brown, these are paint chips that still remained after the burning. These particles are from a burned sample. This is a quartz grain, and this is a feldspar grain. So this is from the study, and looking at Quarry Farm sand and the Chemung River sand, it's a similar makeup. This is just a backup of some information, and I noticed Steve had the same picture on one of his slides. This is a sanded paint surface on Mount Vernon. It simulates stone, and that's what is intended for Quarry Farm, or pardon me, the study as well. This is a 1910 mechanism that was used to apply sand to a wet painted surface. They're called sanding bellows. So there's a hopper, and by pressing exercising the 2 handles at the end, you're creating air flow. The hopper with sand is pushing down sand. The air is blowing sand on the surface. And Steve also had another example of a kind of device to do this. A next step for this project is to figure out what is the best method to apply sand on the building for the restoration. Sand throwing is an option where you just take a wet painted surface and throw sand on it. They did that at Mount Vernon. Or using some kind of device that's going to blow sand on and provide an even surface. The important part is your paint stays wet enough so that when you blow sand on it, it sticks. And then you leave it to dry. If the paint dries too fast, you're not going to have a good product. So I think this effort is probably something that the team will focus on in the near future as part of the restoration. I have, afterwards, if anyone's interested, just some simulated sanded finishes that I put together for this project. If you'd just like to see what it feels like, what it looks like when sand is thrown on. But essentially, it's supposed to look like stone and slightly textured, but does provide a uniform color from a distance as well. And I also have a little sample here too, if anyone's interested on what an amber shellac on a pine board would look like, which would simulate what was on the interior of the study. So that's all I have for today. Is there any questions? Thank you.